In this video, I'm going to be talking about optimizing assets that use displacement maps. Now, the biggest drawback of using displacement is that the generation of the displaced geometry is a single-threaded process which has to take place at the start of every calculated frame. And when you're working in HD, this pre-calculation stage where the geometry cache is being generated can take a very long time indeed. It's not unusual to see pre-calculation times of up to half an hour on every single frame, and this is something you obviously want to avoid if you can. So in order to demonstrate how I would go about optimizing a displaced asset, I've created this simple canyon scene, and it's being heavily displaced by this image map here. And I've done a test render, full HD, and using a displacement rate of 0.5, and I've got a render time of 3.5 minutes with a pre-processing time of almost 2 minutes. So let's see what I can do to improve this. So what I need to do here is to bake the displacement into the actual mesh, but it's also equally important that once I've done this, I optimize the results, because it's really bad to have an unoptimized baked mesh. You're going to have really heavy scene load times, scene save times. It's going to make working in the viewport difficult. It's going to make your render slower. So the best thing to do is that once you've baked your displacement into the mesh, to use polygon reduction tools in order to preserve the actual form of your mesh, but to reduce the geometry as much as possible. Now in Modo, there's two different ways to bake your displacement to a mesh, and I encourage you to experiment with both because I've had good results with both, but one may be better than the other depending on the asset you're dealing with. The first method is to bake the geometry cache, and you can find this command under the render menu. So what you need to do is to select an item in the item list and go render bake geometry cache. You can also find the exact same command under the geometry menu. Here it is. And what this will do is it'll do the pre-processing of your asset just like it would when rendering a frame, and simply freeze that state and bake it to your mesh. And the second method is to use the freeze command. So once again, with your mesh selected, also make sure that it's in sub D mode. Go to the geometry menu and select freeze. Make sure that freeze displacement is activated, and this will also bake the displacement into your mesh. So these two methods work quite differently from one another. The first method that I showed you, which was to bake the geometry cache, is going to take your displacement rate into account. So be aware that this can generate a huge amount of geometry, especially if you've got a big asset which extends far out of the frame. And another potential drawback with this method is that it's going to generate triangles exactly as the render engine itself does, and this means that any further optimization on the asset could be quite difficult to perform. But the second method I showed you, the freeze, is not going to triangulate your mesh. What this is going to do is going to generate the mesh density based on your subdivision level here. So what you can do is you can control exactly how much geometry you're going to generate by appropriately setting this subdivision level before you perform the freeze. Just be aware that in Modo there's two different subdivision algorithms, and you need to make sure that you're using the right one before you perform your freeze. It's quite easy to tell whether you're using normal subdivision or Catmull-Clark subdivision, because when you have your mesh selected, it will tell you here in the heads-up display. You can also go to Info and Statistics and look at polygons by type, and this is telling me that I'm using subdivs here. Now both types of subdivision can be frozen successfully. It's just you need to know where to enter the values, because it's very easy since there's two different places to enter the values depending which subdivision method you're using. It's very easy to enter the values in the wrong place. One difference between Catmull-Clark and regular subdivisions is that every Catmull-Clark subdivision level is 4 times greater than the level below it. Now, as I want to get to quite a high polygon count with this asset, I'm going to get there much quicker if I use Catmull-Clark. So I'm just going to tab out of my regular subdivisions and hold Shift Tab to go into Catmull-Clark sub-Ds. And then it's simply a case of increasing your subdivision level until you get enough polygons in the viewport. But before I do that, there's something I need to show you in Preferences. So if you go to System, Preferences, OpenGL, you'll find this setting here called Max GL Polygon Count. And what this is going to do is that once you exceed this limit, it's going to give you a warning. Now it's not going to prevent you from going past this limit, it's simply going to give you a warning to let you know that you have exceeded the number that's set in this preference, but it's not going to hinder your work in any other way. So now I'm going to gradually increase my subdivision level until I get around 10 to 12 million polygons in the viewport, so keep an eye on the GL polygon count here as I slowly increase the subdivision levels. You see I've got the warning here because now I'm going to go past 1 million. And I'm at 3 million, it's taking a little bit longer to update. I think I'm going to increase it one more time. And you can see it's taking a little while longer to update because it's got to generate the extra geometry in the viewport. But now that it's done it, I'm at 12 million polygons and I'm going to stop at this point. So having increased my polygon count to quite a high number, I'm ready to perform the freeze. So I'm going to go to Geometry Freeze, make sure that Freeze Displacement is on, and I'm going to click OK. Now this is going to take a while, so I'll just pause the video while it's taking place. And with the operation complete, you can see that I've now got a much denser mesh in my viewport. And if I return to the shader tree, you can see that Modo has automatically disabled the displacement map. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this map type to bump and I'm going to re-enable it. Now, of course, now that we've got 12 million polygons in the viewport, the scene file is going to become very heavy. This means that save times are going to be very slow, load times are going to be very slow, and it's going to take up a lot of disk space as well. So what I need to do now is to reduce the geometry on the mesh by using a polygon reduction tool, and this will make every single aspect of dealing with this asset much more pleasant, and it will also speed up the render times. So I'm going to hit F2 on my keyboard to open the modeling tab, and if you go down to polygon, you'll see there's a reduction tool. So if I activate it, what you can do is you can enter a target number of polygons in here. So I've entered 2 million and something, and I'm just going to click in the viewport to activate the tool. Now this operation takes a very, very long time, so I'm going to pause the video while it's going on. So now that the reduction tool is run, I've got a much more manageable 2.5 million polygons in the viewport. It's worth noting though that because the mesh was so aggressively triangulated, applying the bump map was causing errors. There was lots of little holes appearing in the mesh, so I've had to disable it. But now that I've successfully baked my displacement into the mesh and then optimized the resulting mesh, it's time to do a test render to see if that's improved our render times at all. And with the render complete, we can have a look at the render time. It was 1 minute 21 seconds as opposed to 3.5 minutes for the previous one. It's also worth comparing the pre-processing time. The first render took almost 2 minutes to pre-process, whereas the latest one pre-processed in just 42 seconds. So you can see it's considerably faster, and baking the geometry, although it might require a little bit of work up front, is going to save a lot of time once we're in production. Now I've shown you how to complete this process using Modo alone, but very often you'll be getting these kinds of assets as part of a pipeline where they originally come from programs such as ZBrush or Mudbox, and my recommendation would be that if you are exporting from other programs, not to export displacement maps, but rather to do polygon reduction at source if possible. So in ZBrush I would say, rather than export a displacement map, do some polygon reduction on your actual sculpted mesh using Decimation Master and export the polygon reduced decimated mesh into Modo, and that will give you an asset that will render much faster than one using a displacement map. There is a pretty substantial drawback to baking displacement the way that I've just done, and that is even after running the polygon reduction tool, I'm still left with a very heavy mesh, which is 2.5 million polygons in the viewport. This is considerably heavier than the original mesh that I had before displacement. And obviously this is going to make working with this scene quite unpleasant because my save and load times are going to be very slow, and my viewport is also likely to be very slow. So what I need to do here is to use a render proxy so that I can have a low res asset in the viewport and the high res asset only called upon at render time. So I'm going to select my high res geometry in the item list, right click on it and choose Convert to Proxy from the menu. Now this is going to ask me for a name and a location to write the proxy file to disk. So in this case, I'm just going to overwrite a file that I created earlier. When the options come up, I'm going to save it as a static mesh. This is optional, but it can help with performance. Now this is going to take a while to write to disk because obviously it's a pretty heavy file, so I'm just going to pause the video while it's saving. And with the conversion complete, you can see that I've got a different kind of icon around my proxy item now. And more importantly, in the viewport, all I've got now is a bounding box, and my GL count has gone down to 0. My file size will also reduce from hundreds of megabytes to just a few K, so it means that opening and saving this file is going to be very quick, and obviously the viewport itself will also be very quick. So what I'm going to do now is do a test render to see how this affects the performance of the actual render. And here is the completed render, and this time it only took 1 minute and 1 second, and the pre-processing time was just 25 seconds, so this is even faster than the previous render, which took 1 minute and 21 seconds with a pre-processing time of 42 seconds. And this increase in speed is down to the fact that I saved my proxy as a static mesh, which means that it's going to take a lot less pre-processing in order to generate the geometry. Now, one potential caveat of working with render proxies is that the proxy geometry will have to be streamed off disk at render time, and this means that if you're working off a slow network, this could cause slowdowns. However, if your I/O is fast enough to properly support them, they are very worthwhile because they'll make your scene management much easier, and also it will make your viewport performance much faster. A cool thing about proxies is that they allow you to have a low-res item as a stand-in for preview and GL. So I've returned to the 3D view and I've opened the actual proxy file that we saved to disk, and I've also imported the original low-res mesh that we used at the very start, without the displacement map obviously, and I've renamed this Canyon Preview. So I'm just going to hide the high-res item, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Tab just to go to raw polygons for this, and then I'm going to re-enable the high-res mesh, and I'm going to save this file. And having saved my proxy item to disk, I've returned to my scene and selected the proxy item in the item list. And in the options, where it says preview item, I'm going to click browse, and this is going to allow me to choose meshes from within the proxy item saved to disk, and I can choose the low res that I want to use in GL and in preview. And you see, as soon as I've done that, the low res appears in GL. Now I can choose what I want displayed in preview. I can either have the preview item, the low res one, or the full render item, but generally it's best to just use a preview item, and this means that you're only ever going to use the full high-res mesh when you're actually doing a final render. So let me just unpause preview and see what happens. And you can see that this is previewing with the low res, which is exactly what I want because it's going to speed up my preview times. So I'm going to do a final test render to see what that gives us. And here is the completed render, and it's rendered in more or less the same time as the previous one, which is exactly what we'd expect. But you can see that we've gone from an initial render that was inefficiently set up because it was using displacement. We baked that displacement into a mesh and then optimized the resulting mesh. And then in order to make working with a scene more manageable, we saved the high-res geometry that we just created as a render proxy, and then we used a low-res version of it for preview rendering and for the viewport. Because when you're working in production, there's nothing worse than using really heavy scenes that take a long time to open, take a long time to save, that are very slow to navigate around. So using render proxies allows us to use these heavy items without slowing down our day-to-day scene management. We only ever use them at render time, and because we use them with actual geometry rather than displacement, we still get pretty decent render times as well.